The American West is hundreds of thousands of acres of empty land where, in theory, another billion people could live. But one thing stands in the way: water. Look at Nevada. Just over 3 million people live in two clusters: Las Vegas, which relies on the Colorado River like an IV drip, and Reno. For comparison, Ohio is almost 3 times smaller, yet its population is 4 times larger. Why? Because Ohio has water. The West has already hit its natural population ceiling. Researchers figured this out back in the 1980s by looking at rainfall patterns. You'd think the solution would be simple: get more water and build more cities. But 40 years later, water supplies have only shrunk. The Colorado River keeps shrinking, housing demand keeps growing, and the whole situation has turned into a massive demographic dead end. So maybe it's time to crank the system to full power and finish what was started a century ago? Bring water to the deserts, carve new valleys into Nevada, and finally turn barren land into places where people can actually live. Supporters of this idea follow a simple logic. If it worked in California and Florida, why couldn't it work in Nevada? After all, 63 million people now live in gleaming megacities that were once virtually impassable swamps. How did that happen? Here's an unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. And it all came down to massive infrastructure projects. In broad terms, we redirected natural resources, mainly water, to places that had never had any. In Los Angeles, rivers were forced into new channels, groundwater levels were lowered, and the newly freed land turned into 284,000 acres of development. Today, it's one of the fastest growing urban areas on the planet. At the same time, engineers built 3 major water lifelines: the Los Angeles Aqueduct, the Colorado River Aqueduct, and the California Aqueduct. Together, they move hundreds of billions of gallons of water every year for farms, cities, and industry. In Florida, for example, a combination of development, wetland drainage, and air conditioning transformed what was once seen as a practically toxic swamp into one of the most comfortable and attractive regions in the United States. But what exactly would Nevada need in order to achieve something similar? The key to addressing water scarcity isn't building massive dams or counting on some kind of ritual rain dance. We need to start making new water through solar-powered desalination. Solar energy has become so cheap that it now allows us to produce fresh water from salt water at very low cost. As of 2024, the most advanced desalination plants can generate about 264 gallons of water for roughly 40 cents. And according to engineers, major breakthroughs are right around the corner. The idea works like this. Desalination facilities are built along the West Coast, plants that draw in seawater and turn it into drinkable water. These facilities consume huge amounts of electricity, but the American West is absolutely drenched in sunlight, making solar power an obvious power source. Next comes the infrastructure. We'd need a network of surface or underground canals to carry this fresh water through California and into Nevada. And from there, the possibilities are numerous. The water can be sent right to the places that need it or stored in a man-made reservoir, a giant tank that supplies water on demand. There's nothing sci-fi about this. A similar system's already up and running in Israel. We once made a video about how their desalination plants draw water from the Mediterranean and pump it through pipelines all the way to the country's main freshwater lake. One proposal for the U.S. suggests building a chain of water canals along Highway 95. Logistically, it's convenient, and the terrain there is fairly straightforward. In simple terms, the system would work like this. Roughly 497 miles of canals would feed a little over 994 miles of natural drainage channels, those marked in black. That could create about 772 square miles of new irrigated farmland and around 1,467 square miles of new lakes. But as always, things look much easier on paper than they do in the real world. So today we'll talk about that, along with taming an iceberg, deploying colossal space mirrors, and imagining what happens if you build an artificial mountain in the middle of a desert. The big question is, where should this new reservoir lake actually be? The easiest way to understand the options are to look at ancient maps of the area. Barely 10,000 years ago, right after the last ice age, Nevada's climate was completely different. Wetter, full of lakes, rivers, and forests. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths lived here. An entire megafauna. In the image, you can clearly see where those ancient lakes once spread out and what's left of them today. Almost nothing. Lakes form naturally wherever the land creates a basin, a kind of bowl where water can collect. That's why the idea of creating an inland sea makes the most sense in one of these natural depressions. All that remains is choosing how to do it. The first and most straightforward option is to replace the water released from Lake Mead near Las Vegas with desalinated water produced near the Colorado River Delta. If around 1.6 trillion gallons of fresh water were desalinated annually in Mexico or in California's Imperial Valley, it could feed the All-American Canal, the Coachella Canal, and then the Colorado River Aqueduct. Essentially, we're just swapping flows. The second option's a bit more poetic. Restore the Mojave River. Today, it's a dry or partly subterranean stream that begins near Cajon Pass by San Bernardino and runs northeast toward Death Valley, ending in Badwater Basin. The idea isn't to build a lake, but to bring the river back. The upper stretches of the Mojave could easily be supplied by the California Aqueduct, which carries water south from the Sacramento Delta to Los Angeles. This flow could be boosted by additional desalination along the California coast. Sounds great. But what about the financial side? The rough budget looks like this. About $4 billion would go into building a 20-gigawatt solar desalination plant, and another $4 billion would be required for the desalination system itself. Building the canal using Arizona's CAF as a reference point and scaling it up for Nevada comes to roughly $6 billion. Add another $2 billion for the pumps and the solar panels to power them. All in all, you're looking at around $16 billion to restore a massive stretch of Pleistocene-era ecosystem. Supporters claim the potential value of such a transformation exceeds $1 trillion, not even counting future revenue from developing the region. And that's just the American West. But if you think this sounds bold, then hold my beer. Humanity's attempted far more audacious projects to tame the water. In a land where rain is a rare visitor and water is more precious than oil, the United Arab Emirates once contemplated an engineering miracle. The plan sounded like science fiction, or pure madness. Grab a colossal iceberg from Antarctica, haul it to the scorching shores of the Gulf, quench a nation's thirst, seed clouds, and maybe, just maybe, tweak the climate along the way. This ambitious idea, known as the UAE Iceberg Project, was launched in 2017 by the private Abu Dhabi-based firm National Advisor Bureau Limited. As you might guess, the goal was to tow a massive block of ice, roughly 1.2 miles long and about 1,640 feet wide, all the way from Antarctica to the coast of Fujairah, an emirate on the Gulf of Oman. The logic was almost temptingly simple. A typical iceberg holds more than 20 billion gallons of fresh water, enough to supply 1 million people for 5 years. And according to company representatives speaking to local media in 2017, this was the purest water on Earth. The UAE, which consumes about 15% of all desalinated water worldwide and risks depleting its groundwater within the next 15 years, couldn't afford to ignore unconventional solutions. Satellite imagery pinpointed a suitable icy giant near Heard Island in the Southern Ocean. The plan envisioned a 10-month, 7,456-mile journey across the Southern Ocean, then the Indian Ocean, and finally the Arabian Sea before reaching Fujairah's shores. Powerful ocean-faring vessels would tow and guide the iceberg northward until it entered the waters of the Gulf of Oman. The idea was to anchor the iceberg about 1.8 miles off the coast of Fujairah. Right after arrival, crews were supposed to start carving out huge amounts of ice. The idea was to extract as much drinking water as possible within 2 or 3 months before the whole mass began melting too fast. According to the company's modeling data, the iceberg could lose up to 30% of its mass during the journey. To offset that, the team aimed for a winter arrival when UAE waters are cooler and the melt rate slows. And to help the frozen giant survive the voyage at all, the firm designed a patented metal belt, basically a reinforced corset meant to hold the iceberg together against waves and temperature swings. The pilot project was estimated at $60 to $80 million, with a planned launch in 2019. To test the idea, they wanted to tow a smaller iceberg to Cape Town or Perth. The full-scale mission for the UAE was priced at $100 to $150 million. But despite the bold statements, the flashy website, the talk of research teams, and a global humanitarian mission to provide fresh water, nothing ever moved past the announcements. As of 2025, there are no trials, no updates, no official cancellation, just silence. And the truth is, this wasn't even the UAE's first attempt at bending the weather to its will. Back in 2016, an even more ambitious idea was circulating. If nature won't bring rain, why not build an artificial mountain to force clouds to form over the desert? Pretty cool idea. What could possibly go wrong? In early 2016, the U.S. National Center for Atmospheric Research suddenly received an unusual request from the UAE government. The Emirates offered a $400,000 grant and asked a question: could scientists study what would happen to the environment if they built an artificial mountain in the desert? The country was seriously considering building a mountain to boost rainfall and ease an approaching water crisis. In theory, the mountains would force air to rise, form clouds, and then be seeded, sprayed with tiny particles of silver iodide to speed up droplet formation and trigger rain. NCAR even has a dedicated department that focuses specifically on cloud seeding, that is, the effort to artificially increase precipitation. The entire $400,000 went into modeling how such a mountain might work in real-world conditions. Essentially, experts examined how the weather would change depending on the mountain's height, shape, and slope. There was no chosen site yet. Scientists tested various locations across the country, and as they openly admitted, if the project turned out too expensive for the government, it would simply be abandoned. The research wasn't random either. At the time, there were warnings that the Emirates could run out of groundwater in just 14 years. The logic behind the idea is clear. Real mountains play a major role in creating rainfall. They force warm, moist air upward where it cools and forms clouds. One researcher commented that building a mountain is anything but simple. He explained that while scientists were completing their calculations, they were still weighing different options for height, width, and placement. Meanwhile, the UAE gets only about 5 rainy days a year, and summer temperatures often reach 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Judging by the fact that the story surfaced in 2016 and vanished afterward, the project never moved beyond the conceptual stage. Still, it's amusing to imagine something like this could theoretically be attempted in other arid regions too. Though chances are none of them have the kind of money the Emirates do. Most countries, of course, work with what nature's already given them. Take Iceland and its volcanoes, for example. Have you ever wondered what might happen if the raw, primordial power of lava could be turned into the building blocks of the future? Well, an architect and founder of the SAP studio in Reykjavik is taking that idea seriously. Their latest project, lava forming, is essentially a thought experiment. Could the lava from Iceland's volcanoes be used as an eco-friendly construction material, eliminating the need for mining and energy-intensive processing? Right after an eruption, lava looks like thick, glowing molten honey. But if you guide that flow into specially made channels and let it harden, it turns into a strong rock. In other words, you can literally cast foundations for buildings, or at least theoretically, entire neighborhoods or even cities. That's the bold future scenario this research team imagines for the 22nd century. A lava flow carries so much material that the foundations of an entire city could rise within weeks without destructive mining or the use of non-renewable energy. Lava forming explores a resource no one has ever truly considered for construction. Iceland is practically made for this kind of experiment. The country sits right on the mid-Atlantic ridge, where the Eurasian and North American plates pull apart. That's why the island is riddled with volcanoes. Yes, eruptions are a constant threat, but they also give Iceland some unique perks. An enormous supply of geothermal energy that covers about 66% of everything the country consumes. But there's another important point: Iceland has almost no trees left. Once upon a time, a third of the island was forest, but the first Norse settlers cut most of it down for grazing land and charcoal. As a result, wood was no longer a common building material. But before lava can become the future concrete, engineers have a mountain of problems to solve. The biggest issue is that lava burning at 1292 to 2192 degrees Fahrenheit is incredibly hard to control. People have tried redirecting it with earthen walls and trenches, but the results were far from perfect. On top of that, lava cools at different rates and solidifies into wild, unpredictable shapes, which is definitely not great for creating a flat, dependable foundation. In short, there's a ton of work ahead, and the idea is intriguing, just not quite impressive enough. Asteroid mining, though, now that's a whole different story, and I'm not joking. 30 years ago, the legendary BBC program Tomorrow's World tried, in all seriousness, to peer into the future and imagine what the year 2025 might look like. The result turned out to be a great reminder of how unpredictable technological progress really is. Viewers were told that we'd have microchips implanted for ATM access, that we'd chat with holographic assistants at home, and that society would face riots over limited access to the internet. The episode also featured another bold prediction. By this point, humanity would be mining resources on asteroids. And while that still hasn't happened, some argue we're closer to that reality than it may seem. The founder of the California startup Asteroid says his company will be the first to make it there, and they're already on their way. On February 27, 2025, Asteroid launched its first unmanned spacecraft, a $6.5 million mission aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Roughly 9 days later, the spacecraft named Odin passed beyond the moon's orbit and headed into deep space exactly as planned. And the story only gets more interesting from here. After their next launch, scheduled for next year, the company intends to test methods for extracting rare, highly concentrated metals from asteroids that contain them. Scientists point out mining such metals on Earth is becoming increasingly costly, economically, environmentally, and politically. Today, we can only roughly imagine just how difficult this kind of extraction would be. Engineers point out that sending a spacecraft to an asteroid might not be much harder than docking it with another vehicle. But how do you even mine resources in an environment with virtually no stable gravity? For a long time, asteroid mining lived only in academic papers. It wasn't until the 1980s that NASA began seriously exploring ways to use space-based resources. What will come of it all? We may find out sooner rather than later, as space is increasingly being seen not just as a frontier to explore, but as a potential source of valuable materials. Meanwhile, Chinese researchers have unveiled another bold idea, building an orbital solar power station roughly 0.6 miles wide that would beam energy down to Earth continuously using microwaves. Long Leihao, the chief designer behind the Long March rockets, described it as a project they're genuinely excited about. According to their calculations, in just 1 year, this station could harvest as much energy as humanity extracts from oil over the same period. But even with the massive advances in lowering the cost and boosting the efficiency of solar panels, there are fundamental limits. Clouds block sunlight on Earth, and a significant portion of solar energy never reaches the ground because it's absorbed or scattered in the atmosphere. That's why scientists are pushing the idea of space-based solar power, or SBSP. The idea is to capture sunlight in space where it's nearly 10 times more intense and then transmit that energy back to Earth. There's just one catch. Assembling a solar array of that scale would require a huge number of launches, and most of the previous initiatives stalled because of the extreme logistical and financial burden. To tackle this, the team is developing a new reusable heavy lift rocket, the Long March 9. It's designed to carry at least 150 tons into orbit. That capacity would let them transport much larger station modules and dramatically cut the cost of assembling the structure in space. And if the idea of a spaceborne power plant still sounds far-fetched, how about a giant orbital mirror? Imagine this. You crawl into bed after a long day, switch off the lights, and suddenly your window lights up as if morning has come early. Sounds bizarre, but that's exactly what might happen if one American company succeeds. A startup called Reflect Orbital wants to launch massive mirrors into space and sell sunlight after sunset. The California-based team claims that redirected artificial sunlight can do all sorts of things, like easing energy shortages or illuminating disaster zones during rescue operations when power is out. The company has already applied to the U.S. Federal Communications Commission to launch its first satellite, Arendelle-1. The idea is for the satellite to aim reflected sunlight at specific spots on Earth, for example, solar farms, so they can keep generating energy even at night. Reflect Orbital has proposed several mirror satellite sizes, 33 by 33 feet, 60 by 60, and even 117 by 117 feet. But experts aren't convinced. They argue that to light up a large solar plant, you wouldn't need one satellite, you'd need thousands. Astronomer Michael Brown of Monash University explained that if you wanted brightness comparable to the midday sun, you'd need a mirror the same apparent size as the sun in the sky, meaning several miles across. No one's sending something like that into orbit, which is why the whole concept relies on countless small mirrors instead. By some estimates, just to provide 20% of daylight levels, you'd need around 3,000 mirrors, about 581 square feet in size, and possibly more. Reflect Orbital hasn't offered further comments. But don't worry, I did find plenty of information about a gigantic wildlife crossing project. The Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing is truly a monumental project. It's being built to give animals a safe passage over one of the busiest highways in the United States. The goal is to support local biodiversity, expand habitat for important pollinators, and prevent the local mountain lion population from dying out. Basically, it's a project fighting for everything good and against everything that harms nature. But this is far more than just a bridge with grass on top. The project includes a complex ecological restoration plan on the crossing itself and in the surrounding area, covering roughly 12 acres. They're creating fully functional habitats. There will be native plants, water sources, shelters, and food, everything dozens of species need to live and reproduce normally. When it's finished, the crossing will be the largest of its kind in the world, the first in California, and a model for how to protect wildlife right inside major urban regions. It's rising above the busy 101 freeway in Agora Hills, about 35 miles northwest of Los Angeles. The first phase is nearly complete, and the second began this summer. It's a $92 million public-private partnership. The California Department of Transportation is leading the project, while the National Wildlife Federation is responsible for fundraising. The 12-acre crossing will span all 10 lanes of the highway. Research by the National Park Service has shown that highways like this one aren't just deadly for animals trying to run across, they also fragment habitats into isolated pockets. As a result, cougars, bobcats, birds, lizards, and many other species stop exchanging genes, end up inbreeding, and eventually face extinction. The main difference between a wildlife overpass and a regular road bridge is that engineers don't deal with temporary loads from vehicles, but with a constant one, the weight of soil, vegetation, and water. One of the designers explained that the top layer is made of water-saturated soil, and that alone has to be carefully factored in. According to their calculations, the density of this filling on the upper part of the structure reached about 6.8 tons per 35 cubic feet. There's another unique twist to projects like this. Concrete color and lighting were chosen to be less stressful for animals while still keeping drivers safe. Even the soil placed on top was engineered at the molecular level so it would stay in place and support plants and the wildlife using the bridge. In short, it's an incredibly cool ecological project. You owe me a like. See you later.